Okay, so hi everyone. We're going to get started for those of you at home. So my name is Dr. Galen Watts, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, also an associate director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Future, and very excited to be chairing and hosting this talk. We have a great guest speaker here in person actually with us, Dr. Kevin Flatt, and it's my honor to introduce him. So Dr. Flatt is a professor of history as well as an associate dean of humanities at Redeemer University. He teaches courses covering areas of modern history in Canada, Europe, but also the Middle East. His research focuses on the study of religion, as you might expect, but with a kind of focus on secularization. And his first and only book so far is After Evangelicalism, the 60s in the United Church of Canada, published in 2013 with McGill Queen's University Press. But today we're going to hear, I think, some work which is part of his forthcoming book on secularization. And so the title for his talk, What If There Is No Such Thing as Religion? Implications for Secularization Theory. I'm really excited. Without further ado, Dr. Flatt, please.
Well, thank you very much, Galen, for that introduction. And thank you also to Carol Ann and Sarah, as well as Galen, for the invitation to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here as part of the lineup of the IRCSF. And I think I nailed the acronym there. And a particularly warm welcome to those of you who are here either in person or on Zoom. I see a lot of familiar names and faces on Zoom in particular. So welcome. And this morning, or pardon me, this afternoon, as Galen mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the arguments that I make in a book that I have forthcoming with Routledge Press. And what I'd like to focus on this morning, or pardon me again, this afternoon, is the way that sometimes our common sense concepts that we use, or sort of our everyday concepts that we use as scholars, often shape the direction of our research. And I want to focus on how an everyday concept like religion is maybe less obvious or less universal than it first appears, and then explore some of the implications of that idea, particularly for our study of secularization. Now, I have to say at the outset, I don't actually think that there's no such thing as religion. So I'm sorry if you're here only because you're hoping to hear that. That's maybe a little bit of a bait and switch, but we thought it would be maybe an interesting way of titling the talk. But I am going to ask, where does this concept of religion come from? And if we were to sort of relax some of our assumptions about what religion is, how might that affect the way we think about secularization? So we'll start off by asking the question, what is secularization? And if that word means anything to you, if the word secularization conjures up any sort of images or associations, it probably conjures up images like these. So this is a graph showing the change in membership of Canada's three largest Protestant churches, the United Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada, since 1965. I've set them all equal to 100 in 1965, so you can see the percentage change. And from 1965 until the end of the century, they all lost roughly 40% of their members. And probably it won't surprise anyone to know that that trend has continued through the first quarter of the 21st century. And we could show similar data for most of the traditionally dominant Christian churches in most Western societies. And so when we think of secularization, often this is one of the things that comes to mind, this idea of kind of decline in church attendance, church involvement, and so on. Another image that might come to mind, and I put this in here partly for Sarah, is kind of the reverse of this image, is the increasing number of people who say that they have no religion. And I'm just going to change the Zoom screen here a little bit. Oh, it doesn't look like I can. Oh, there we go. So you can see a little bit better. A couple of pieces of data here. So one is actually from a paper that Sarah published a couple of years ago. And what this shows is basically that each generation of Canadians is less likely than the preceding generation to identify with a particular religious group in Canada. Or in other words, they're more likely to be part of what we call the nones, the people who have no religious affiliation. We can show similar data for the US. This is recent data from the Pew Center showing that now something more than a quarter of American adults say they have no religion. They're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. So normally when we're thinking of secularization, this is the kind of thing that we're thinking of. Fewer and fewer people participate in organized religious activities, identify themselves as following a religion, or think that religion is important in their lives. And so secularization then is the decline of some identifiable thing called religion. And implicitly, this understanding of secularization assumes that there is a thing called religion that we can distinguish from other aspects of life. I want to dig into that a little bit more. So when we think of religion, if we think of secularization as the decline of religion, and then if we think of what religion is, typically we mean something like activities and institutions that relate to God or the gods. So the things on kind of the left-hand side of this image here, this is what we think of when we think of what religion is. And everything else is not religion. It's in a box that sometimes we call secular. And here we include activities and institutions other than religion: work, play, entertainment, politics. This politics image maybe feels a little bit nostalgic almost, given how rapidly things are changing in the world. So we make this distinction, religion and not religion. And so secularization then is a decline of the stuff on the left-hand side of this image. And we have less and less of that in society over time. And what we're left with is the other stuff that is secular or not religion. And this is, I think, how the ordinary person, if they have an idea of secularization, this is how most of us think of secularization. It's also how scholars think of secularization. For example, one leading scholar, Steve Bruce, a Scottish sociologist, he defines secularization as a decline in the social significance of religion. That particular formulation is pretty widespread among scholars. And he goes on to elaborate what he means by that. He says he's talking about the decay of religious institutions, a decline in the proportion of their time, energy, and resources that people devote to supernatural concerns, and a decline in the number of religious people and the extent to which people are religious. And other scholars, they have different variations on this, but they all are fundamentally similar in the sense that they all define secularization in terms of this other concept, religion, and having less of it, or it being less important in some way. Now, these categories, religion, the secular, are kind of part of our mental furniture in the modern West. And so we take them for granted. We assume that they're just kind of universally applicable human categories like family, work, government. And so implicitly, we're saying you should be able to look at any human society, past or present, and be able to say, okay, over here we have some stuff that is religion, and over here we have some stuff that isn't religion. And if the religion stuff is declining or shrinking in importance, then that is secularization. And we should be able to make those distinctions and those judgments just kind of universally. But is that in fact true? Is religion a universal human category that people just in general around the world and in different time periods use to make sense of their experience? More and more scholars have been asking this question in recent decades. And it turns out for most of them, the answer is actually no. Religion is not a universal human category. And broadly speaking, they developed two main lines of argument. And I'll summarize each of these briefly. So the first main line of argument has to do with cultures outside of the West, what we sometimes, for convenience, call non-Western cultures. And a number of scholars have argued that historically, outside of European society, outside of the West, there were no indigenous terms that corresponded in meaning to our word religion, the way that we use that word in English and its equivalent in other modern European languages. For instance, there were no words that correspond in meaning to religion in ancient Egypt, in ancient Mesopotamia, or in ancient Iran, nor among traditional African cultures, nor among the Aztecs. Indian languages and Indian-derived traditions like Buddhism have no traditional word for religion in the sense in which we use that word. Neither did China or Japan prior to the 19th century. In the 19th century, the Japanese government actually invented a word so that they could translate the European words for religion into Japanese. They took another existing term in Japanese and repurposed it as a matter of government policy. And the Chinese then later imported this word into China, or the Chinese equivalent, and used it for their term religion. So the modern Chinese and Japanese words for religion are only about 150 years old. And again, none of these cultures had their own terms to translate this word religion that we have in European languages. One of these scholars, Tomoko Masuzawa, she summarizes this line of argument by saying, this concept of religion as a general transcultural phenomenon is patently groundless. And so this concept that there's this distinct separate area of life called religion that can be distinguished from other parts of life that requires its own word seems to be a uniquely, peculiarly Western idea. And it's not because these cultures had no activities or ideas that we would register as being religious. If you know anything about the history of any of the cultures that I mentioned, you know that they, of course, did have activities and ideas that we would consider religious, but they did not conceptually distinguish an area of life that they called religion from other areas of life. So that's the first main line of argument, that in non-Western cultures, we don't see that distinction or that category prior to it being borrowed from the West. The other main line of argument, and this is where the plot thickens, is that actually the same thing is true even of Western culture if you go back far enough. If you go into the pre-modern history of Western cultures, you actually find the same thing. The further back you go, the more words like religion or secular, or at least the precursors of those words, change their meaning into something quite different and even unrecognizable. So for example, the ancient Latin word religio, which is the ultimate root of our modern English word religion, did not originally mean what we mean by religion. And if we had a little more time, I'd go into that in a little more detail. Maybe in the Q&A we can explore that a bit. But it takes many permutations over the course of almost 2 millennia before finally, in approximately the 17th century, we start to see a word religion being used roughly in the way that we use it now, to refer to something having to do with the church and certain aspects of private life that can be distinguished from politics and other activities. That doesn't happen again until about the 17th century in Europe. Even more so, the corresponding term secular, that's now kind of our opposite in this pairing of religious and secular, that term doesn't acquire its modern meaning until the 19th century in European languages. So at most 2 centuries ago. So one of these scholars, Brent Nongbree, in his book Before Religion, he concludes the concept of religion does indeed have a history. It is not a native category to ancient cultures, including Western cultures. The idea of religion as a sphere of life separate from politics, economics, and science is a recent development in European history, one that has been projected outward in space and backwards in time. So again, this conceptual framework is not universal. It's culturally specific. It's very modern. It's specifically Western. And if we trace how did these concepts emerge in Western culture, it turns out a large part of the reason for their emergence actually was because of the process of secularization itself. So these terms were produced by secularization. The conceptual terms that we're using to explain and describe secularization are themselves a byproduct of the secularization process. In particular, the terms religion and secular came to embody the idea that things having to do with God or higher powers are in fact intrinsically different and distinct from things like politics and economics and family life and so on. And in that sense, they're sort of extras. They're sort of optional aspects of human life. And so these terms are not ideologically neutral or perspectively neutral, but they reflect certain cultural assumptions, which are the product of a particular time and place. In my book, I make the case that this fact that these are culturally specific terms that arose through a process of secularization actually affects secularization scholarship in a number of ways. It sort of tips secularization scholarship in a number of directions, and we can maybe talk about a little bit of that in the Q&A as well, if people are curious. Okay, so if concepts like religion and the secular are culturally specific modern Western terms rather than universal categories, what implications might this have for how we think about secularization? Well, for today, I want to focus just on one thought experiment. Normally, what we do as scholars of secularization is we start with these modern Western concepts and use them to interpret the historical and present-day experience of not only Western societies, but also the rest of the world. We kind of use these as our lens through which we view the rest of the human experience. We see this in scholarship, for example, that goes to contemporary China, as the World Values Survey does, and tries to measure how religious or secular people are. In fact, even goes to people in China and asks them, how important is religion in your life? Or that tries to look at the medieval Islamic world and ask, what's the relationship between religion and politics in medieval Islam? Assuming that religion and politics are two different distinguishable things, we have to understand how they related to each other. And so we sort of try to squeeze the experience of these societies into these modern Western categories, something that becomes more and more difficult and potentially more and more misleading as we go further back in time. And so what I'd like to propose as a thought experiment is, what if we tried doing the opposite of this? So just like Copernicus proposed saying, what if instead of seeing the Earth as the center of the universe around which the sun and the other heavenly bodies revolve, what if we saw the sun as the center and the Earth revolved around it? I'm proposing, hopefully, a much more modest kind of Copernican revolution in our thinking about secularization. What if instead of telling the story of the world using modern Western concepts, again that are highly unusual in terms of the big picture of the human experience, what if we told the story of the West using concepts from outside the modern West, using global concepts? And so if other historical cultures did not distinguish conceptually between religion and the rest of life, what would it look like to tell the story of the secularization of Western society from the perspective of their conceptual frameworks, their frameworks for making sense of reality? What might we learn or notice about the Western experience of secularization that we don't see very easily precisely because we're using the concepts that secularization produced to understand secularization. So to begin to get at how we might do this, I borrow an idea from the sociologist Philip Rieff, the late American sociologist Philip Rieff. Philip Rieff was a bit of an eccentric guy, to put it mildly. Towards the end of his life, he published this trilogy of books called the Sacred Order, Social Order trilogy, which I don't recommend actually trying to read, to be blunt. One reviewer called this book, My Life Among the Deathworks, the weirdest book ever, which has got to be one of my favorite quotations from a scholarly book review. And there's not a lot that I agree with about Rieff's framework. But there's one observation that he makes that I think is quite profound, and that is, in most human cultures, including pre-modern Western cultures, social order reflected sacred order. And what he meant by that is that in these historical cultures, we find that people tried to align human life, including human life in its social dimensions, how we live our lives together, the patterns and institutions that shape our lives. They tried to align these with a cosmic order and authorities that are in some sense above human beings, to which human beings owe reverence and obedience. And importantly, here by human life, we mean human life in its entirety, comprehensively, not just an aspect of human life that we call religion, but human life as a whole. So one scholar, for example, William Kavanaugh, when discussing the ancient Aztec or Mexica practice of human sacrifice, he asks, should we think of human sacrifice as a political act or a religious act? And he says that question doesn't make sense, actually, to ask in an Aztec context. Instead, he says, I quote, for the Aztecs, sacrifices to the gods were simply part of the proper ordering of the cosmos and society. The ordering of human society was a microcosm of the larger cosmic order. Charles Taylor uses the word cosmic embedding for this idea that societies were embedded in an orderly cosmos. And so I propose my own kind of term for this idea, which I call sacred social order. And I propose that we might refer to pre-modern and non-Western societies as possessing not religions, in our sense, but as possessing sacred social orders, that is, comprehensive orderings of human life that aligned every area of human activity with something suprahuman, with something above the human plane, a cosmic order, God, the gods, and so on. And not only do we see this in practice, of course, with massive variety in a huge range of human societies, but interestingly, we also very commonly see concepts articulating this specific idea in major historical traditions. And I'll give just 3 examples, but they're 3 examples that cover massive historically influential cultural traditions that have influenced many people. And I'll start by referencing the concept of Dharma, which is arguably the central concept in the great cultural and philosophical traditions of India that, of course, have been exported to many other parts of the world. So this concept of Dharma notoriously is hard to translate simply into English, but fundamentally it means the right way of living that is in accordance with or in alignment with the fundamental ordering of the cosmos. It's about aligning, in the sense of law or duty or right action, human life, human behavior, with something above the human plane. And again, importantly, Dharma governs not only activities that we might call religious, although it certainly governs those, but it also governs everything from kingship to marriage, to warfare, to eating, to the direction one should face when relieving oneself. All of that, like from the mundane to the sort of high-level questions of social order, is related to and covered by this concept of Dharma. Somewhat analogous ideas pervade classical Chinese thought. where we find the notion of living in accordance with the will of heaven or Tian, and of following the way or the Tao that is part of the very foundation of reality. And so we see in sort of classical Chinese political thought the idea that the emperor rules by the will of heaven and requires the mandate of heaven to rule. That's the basis of his authority. We see in the Analects of Confucius the idea that it is actually heaven that has commissioned and raised up Confucius to instruct his students in the correct way of living, following the Tao. We see this in Taoism, which of course takes its name from the concept of the Tao, and the idea that the wise man or the wise woman is the one who conforms his or her life to the Tao and to the will of heaven. And again, this refers not only to things like sacrifices to the gods, although it includes that, but it includes the whole web of social interactions. Third and final example, the classical Islamic notion of law, of God's law, Sharia, refers not just to what we might call religious law, but it refers to God's comprehensive will for the entirety of human life. It encompasses everything from what we might call criminal law to rules concerning food and hygiene, to marriage and divorce, to inheritance, to the just conduct of warfare. All of that is encompassed by the concept of Sharia. And so again, all of these concepts, which have been massively, of course, influential in the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of human beings, have in common, they have many differences, of course, but they have in common this idea that human life in its entirety needs to be aligned with some kind of higher authoritative order or set of principles that is above the human plane. It's not a human construction. It's not something that can be changed by humans, but we have to align ourselves with it. And so I sum up what these ideas have in common with this term, sacred social order. Okay, so I'm proposing this as kind of an alternative concept that we might play with in thinking about what secularization is. So that brings us back to secularization. So if we were to reimagine what secularization is, and particularly what the Western experience of secularization is, using these global ideas, these ideas that I would argue are far more widespread in the human experience than the modern Western idea of religion, which seems to be very culturally specific. What are some of the implications we might draw out that we might otherwise not put as much emphasis on in thinking about secularization? So I don't have time, of course, to draw out all of the implications, but I'll mention 4 key implications. First, from the perspective of sacred social order, secularization is not only the decline of some aspect of life labeled religion. Certainly it includes that. All of the stuff that was indicated by that first graph that I showed you, a decline in church going, a decline in how important people feel that religion is in their lives, decline in personal practices of things like prayer. So it includes that. But secularization also, from a sacred social order perspective, entails the reorientation of all social domains. And this is because the old sacred social order, in the case of the West, the sacred social order of early modern Western Christendom, had comprehensive implications for society, as other sacred social orders do. And so one analogy that I like to use for this is to look at what happened in the late Roman Empire. And if you want to look around historically, are there other instances when an entire sacred social order in a society has been replaced by something else? And for my way of thinking, probably the best example that we have of this happening on a large scale is what happened in the late Roman Empire, late antiquity, with the Christianization of the late Roman world. Now, we could look at what happened in the late Roman Empire, and we could describe this as the decline of pagan worship. This is what we do with our concept of secularization, right? We look at Western society, we say we have the decline of religion, decline of church going, and so on. And we could look at what happened in late antiquity in the Roman world and say, what we have here is a phenomenon that we call the decline of pagan worship. And that, of course, did happen, right? You see fewer and fewer people going to worship at the old pagan temples. Eventually, you have actually a banning on public pagan worship towards the end of the 4th century. But if we were only to call what happened in the late Roman Empire the decline of pagan worship, we would actually be missing most of the story of what happened. It's true to talk about that, but there's this bigger picture of the transformation of the whole framework of Roman society, including government, law, family life, education, even the calendar, right? The concepts of time. How do we order our sense of time? All of that was transformed through this Christianization process. And I would argue the same is true of the secularization of Western societies. We have to think about the changes that occurred in all of these social domains, not just the decline of this one aspect of life that we call religion. So that's the first implication. The second implication, which follows from it, is that secularization, what you might call the secular revolution, is not just taking away something, religion, it's also building something new. It's not just what Charles Taylor calls a subtraction story, it's also a construction story. It's the creation of a new kind of social order. In fact, it's the creation of an unprecedented kind of social order. The secularization of the West is, I think, to our knowledge, or at least to my knowledge, and I'm happy to be corrected, it's to our knowledge the first attempt on a society-wide scale to construct a social order that does not base itself upon or does not look to some kind of suprahuman authority or cosmic order as the basis for the direction and legitimacy of the social arrangements in that society. Instead, it's the world's first, again on a society-wide scale, the world's first, what Charles Taylor would call an exclusively humanistic social order. And again, I think this is truly revolutionary. No other society has attempted this. And if we only think of secularization as the decline of religion, I think it understates the extent to which something new is happening. A third implication, and here I want to broaden our view from purely looking at the West to the world as a whole. I would argue that the global spread of secularization in the past century or two is first and foremost the spread of this secular social order, even more than it is about the decline of religion in the modern Western sense. And in the last couple of centuries, the secular order has expanded from the West to many other parts of the world, to Africa, to Asia, to the Middle East, through a combination of vectors. We have, of course, in some cases, colonial imposition by Western colonial empires. But we also have more diffuse forms of cultural influence. We also have, and to me, this is one of the most interesting cases, intentional imitation by modernizing reformers. The classic example of this that I think of is Turkey through much of the 20th century, particularly under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who came to power in the 1920s. He very intentionally secularized the social order of Turkey, trying to construct a new society out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. We can also think of India after independence in 1947, 1948. We can think of China and some other communist societies, in the case of China, particularly under Mao Zedong, where again, there's this intentional secularization of the social order. And in each of those cases, what we would call religion actually remains massively popular at a popular level in these societies, at least for a very long time. But what is secularized is precisely the social order. And so what's happening there is primarily transformations in domains that we think of as being non-religious: politics, law, education, economics, which had been embedded in sacred social orders previously. So that's the third point. And the fourth and final point is that I think this perspective also helps us make better sense of reactions to the secular order that have emerged in other parts of the world. And this is because the export of a sort of a Western style secular social order has also sparked resistance. in a variety of forms, quite a wide diversity of forms, ranging from the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 20th century, associated with figures like Sayyid Qutb, the rise of the AK Party, or the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, which has become the most has become the dominant political party in Turkey, the rise of the BJP in India, and which is influenced by the ideology of Hindutva, and even something we wouldn't normally associate with this, but I think is part of the same phenomenon, the recent revival of Confucian social and political thought among intellectuals in East Asia, both inside and outside of China. And Western observers, when we look at these movements, we sort of try to shoehorn them into this category of religious revivals, or sometimes religious fundamentalism, quote unquote. And of course, there's an element of that that I think is correct, that we're capturing something that's happening there. But that category of religion, I think, is too narrow to really understand what's happening. It's not that we have movements of religious revival that are sort of trying to mix religion and politics, is the way we often think about it. I'd argue that we would actually understand these movements better if we saw them as attempts to restore older sacred social orders adapted for modern conditions. And so they're reactions against secular orders that have been constructed along Western models in these parts of the world. And so what they're doing, and I would argue, if we understand them on their own terms, what they're doing is not just reviving religions, they are attempting to revive sacred social orders, actually. So those are a few ways that I think flipping the lens and thinking outside of our own modern Western cultural categories might highlight some things or help us to notice some things that we might otherwise miss in our study of secularization. So I don't think we have to do away with the concept of religion. I think, of course, the things that we describe with religion are real things. I'm not saying that they don't exist. But I'm saying that if we consider some alternative conceptual frameworks, we might learn something new. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Sarah, do you want me to come up there?
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Flatt. I'm just going to stand here for everyone. So we're going to open it up for questions. I'm going to go sit down and monitor the chat. And I think Dr. Flatt is going to stay here. Questions from anyone at home or here in person. Sarah, yeah.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Yes, super fascinating talk. I think a lot of us are trying to think about how to at least expand the secularization paradigm to go beyond just that subtraction story, as you mentioned, Charles Taylor calls it. And so some really fascinating concepts here and kind of ties into some of the stuff that Galen and I have been thinking about recently. So my question then is, I have lots of them that kind of follows up from that. But what do you see as the substantive content of this secular social order then, right? You called it that secular social order. Yeah. And it's one thing to say, yeah, there's this substantive content to secularity, but what is it in your view, right? What is replacing, has replaced religion in some ways, and kind of what are the key elements there? You mentioned quickly like a humanist order, but what, maybe you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to be asking, right? Because if the secular is not just an absence or a lack of religion, but it's something that has substantive content, what is that content? So I'm going to use the example of the political sphere, okay? So in early modern Europe, prior to secularization, right, you have this sort of sacred social order of early modern Christendom. And what you see is a variety of attempts to explain and legitimate political authority, which all ultimately point back to the will of God. You find, of course, parallel efforts in Islamic societies throughout most of the history of the Islamic world. In classical Chinese political thought, which I alluded to earlier, you have this concept of Tian, or heaven, and the will of heaven. And so in each of these societies, you have a way of explaining who should have political power, what does political power entail, what are the limits, if any, to that power, And how should that power be exercised? Like what directs kind of the use of that power? What are the proper objects of it? And in each of these cases, it is explained in terms of something above the human. And so in the secular order, what distinguishes secular orders, because I think you can have multiple versions of this, from sacred social orders, is that precisely they do not appeal to something above the human plane. And so in the main tradition that has become dominant in Western societies, which is a sort of individualistic version, we need to somehow account for why should we have political authorities in terms of purely human considerations. And so here I would look at something like the gradual development of social contract theory in classical Western political thought through the work of people like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, who are trying to look for, if we wanted to explain why should we have kings and governments and what are they here to do, purely in terms of what do we think benefits us as humans, and we'll kind of leave God out of the equation. And of course, most of those initial thinkers believed in God, would have thought of themselves as Christians or at least as theists, but they're trying to come up with what's kind of a purely human justification for political order. And now that's kind of the normal way that we think about politics. Regardless of our political ideologies, when we're making the case for a form of government or a set of political policies, we're asking in terms of human considerations, what is going to be the most beneficial? And I would say in the political sphere in the modern West, what we notice in the political sphere is also true in other areas of life, which is kind of the most fundamental value, which you could even call a kind of a sacred value, even though it's purely humanistic, is the idea of individual autonomy. The idea that as much as possible, individuals should be free to decide themselves what their lives should look like, what they're going to do. And the only limits on that really are the limits that are necessary to enable everybody to do that. And that's kind of at the heart of at least one major strand of classical liberal political theory. And I think I could say more about that, but I think this idea of human autonomy, that word autonomy literally meaning self-law, is the central characteristic. I think you can have non-individualistic versions of secular order. And so if we think about the communist societies of the 20th century, based on Marxism-Leninism, you see more collectivistic versions of secular order that are still purely humanistic, but are less individualistic. But I think in the West, they're primarily individualistic. So, but of course, there's so much more we could say about this. I'll cut myself off there.
That's great. Well, I know Ryan Kragan has had a question, his hand's up. So I'm going to turn on the volume so you can actually.
Can you hear me?
Yes, faintly.
Oh, okay. I'll try and talk loud.
Just wait 1 sec, Ryan. We're going to turn you up.
Okay.
I
can always post it in the chat.
No, we're good. We're good.
We're good? Okay. Thank you, Kevin. This is an interesting presentation. Like Sarah, I have lots of questions. Obviously, other people do too. So we'll I'll throw the one that maybe it's not even a fair question for you. So if it's not, like, just punt and say this doesn't make any sense. As myself, a quantitative leaning scholar, okay, I'm wondering how you would measure social order. Because this is something that I would, if we were to adopt your understanding of this, right, like I would have to figure out how to do this. And then in particular, I'm interested in how we would measure change over time. So secularization, of course, we think about as a process that takes place over time. How would we capture this and measure this so we could establish that secularization is actually happening? Thanks.
Yeah, fascinating question, and I won't punt it. I'll half punt it, partly by saying I'm hoping people who are smarter than I am will come up, if they find this concept interesting, will find out ways of operationalizing it in terms of measurement. But if we look at something like the World Values Survey, and you look at the questions they're using to determine levels of religiosity, and I think I alluded to this in my talk briefly, they're quite poorly suited, I think, to capturing this idea of sacred social order, at least outside of the context of the Abrahamic religions, okay? So particularly in East Asia, to ask people, how religious are you? How often do you attend religious services? It tells you something, but it's not well suited to capturing this idea. So, I can imagine if you want to look at the level of individual attitudes and how those change over time, as something like the World Values Survey does, could we design questions that get at this idea of, do you think human social institutions like government, family life, etc., should be subordinated to or accountable to or aligned with or oriented to something suprahuman. And again, what that is maybe going to look different in different cultural contexts. You know, in a Western context, you might ask something like, should politicians concern themselves with the will of God? And that's something that I think you could quantify. I think it's something that you could measure over time. I think if you were careful in how you worded the questions, you could find at least some dimensions of this that you could compare cross-culturally. You'd have to have people who are good at translating, into various languages, because that's where I think where a lot of the problems might arise. So I think that's one way. I think, though, a lot of our focus, understandably, or a lot of the focus of sociologists of religion has been on measuring sort of individual level factors. But I think part of what I'd argue for is that we also need to look at structural changes in some of these larger social structures, including political structures. And so there, I think other methods of analysis, which are going to be, I think, maybe more cultural and qualitative, would have to come into play as well, especially to measure change over long periods of time. So that's kind of the beginning of an answer. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So we have another. I'm gonna give priority to those who are willing to speak on camera. So Gene, I'm gonna punt it over to you, and I'll turn you up.
Dr. Haas, nice to see you.
Hi, Kevin. Nice to hear you give the lecture again. Your final point, if I could just twist it a bit, because you say that using sort of non-Western frameworks of religion and, well, how they see the transhuman frame is affecting all of life, would that not be also helpful for analyzing what's going on in the West? And you've kind of touched on that already. And of course, Charles Taylor talks about, in his Secular Age, he says, he talks about that, the tensions in society, and you've already touched on those, that sort of human autonomy, authenticity, all those sorts of things. The immanent frame is sort of the reigning worldview. And yet there are people are not happy with that, right? They miss something transcendent. So, but there's these tensions in there, because you can't have a society without common values that you all agree to. We have the Charter of Rights, the Americans have their Constitution. So would that not be helpful in analyzing sort of what's going on in Western society as well?
Yeah, I do think so. Thank you for the question, Dean. So, one thing that I think is important to emphasize is that, and again, this comes from the idea of a construction story, that I do think all societies have organizing systems of values. Mm-hmm. And I would even go so far as to say, and this is where my terminology kind of breaks down a little bit, or it's one of the limitations of my terminology, that there are, I would argue, in every human society, some values that are sacred in kind of a Durkheimian sense. So they're things that really ought not to be questioned, that are sort of set apart as special. And in our current society, I would say individual autonomy would be at the center of that. And so I think one of the questions we want to be asking when we look at more secular societies is what are these systems of values? Again, it's not just that religion is missing, it's that there's an alternative way of making sense of social life and individual life. People are still living according to some sense of what meaning is. And there are non-religious alternatives, for lack of a better word, secular alternatives. And there might be quite a large variety of those. I was talking with Sarah about this earlier. One of the areas of research that I'm quite interested in, even though I'm not engaged in it myself, I'm quite interested in what other people are finding, is sort of looking into the value systems, the worldviews, the kind of life narratives of people who see themselves as non-religious in Western society. So what for them are the important values? What do they see as their sources of meaning? And then one other point I'll make, I think this is at least tangentially related to what you're talking about. It's important to remember these are kind of ideal types. And in any given society, you can have a dominant system of values, either like really dominant or maybe it's an uneasy dominance. But then, of course, you also have lots of alternatives that exist and that people are following to some extent within the boundaries that are sort of tolerated by whatever the hegemonic or dominant system of value is. And that's not a new situation in the secular order. What's new is that the dominant system is some kind of a secular system. And there are rival systems or alternative systems that might be religious ones. But every historical society, or at least most historical societies, you see some degree of diversity, right? So, in the Ottoman Empire, you have a dominant social order, which is based on Sunni Islam. But you also have Jewish communities, different Christian communities, which in the case of the Ottoman Empire are actually very formally organized and live within a certain framework that is overall set by Sunni Islam. So I don't want to give the impression that it's kind of monolithic, that everybody in a secular society has kind of the same ideas, or that everybody living under a sacred social order has the same. You do have a dominant framework.
Okay, I know there's some questions in the chat, but I'm going to take this opportunity to ask my own question because I'm here. So I really enjoyed this, Kevin. I'm with you, and I think you've got some really key insights. So this question I want to summarize as my kind of understanding of maybe your thesis, which is something like, we should understand secularization as something like the transformation of a social order once premised on a suprahuman cosmic frame to a social order that is now fundamentally, imminently human. Okay, and within that, then you might even say, tell me if I'm wrong, that process, which I think you think is unique to the West,
as something that emerges indigenously, it's unique to
the West. Yeah, unique to, exactly. Okay, so that's what I meant by unique. Yeah, so it emerges indigenously to the West, and it also, a kind of subset of it is something like the invention and then decline of religion.
Yeah.
Am I right about that? That's like a sub. Okay. So then the question I have is more, that's, I think, a really interesting way of framing this process. But then you have to explain what caused it, which of course secularization theory is trying to do.
Right.
And I'm thinking, there's lots of different things I could say, but one would be the Berger thesis, which is that this didn't just happen indigenously to Christianity by accident, but actually reflects some kind of unfolding logic within Christianity. And I'd be curious, A, what you think of that idea, and then B, how do you make sense of, say, the Protestant Reformation within this frame?
Right. Yeah, so I'll start with like the very kind of broad level where I stand in terms of the causality questions. And then I'll zero in on the specific question of like, is there something in the trajectory of Christendom that leads to this outcome? So broadly speaking, I would align myself with what I would call kind of the historicist school in terms of thinking about causality and secularization, that rather than thinking of secularization as the product of a universal developmental process that occurs in human societies, which is
that's totally, I'm on the same board.
So I would say, we need to look at, okay, there may be broad general factors that predispose things one way or the other, but then we have to look at kind of what are the historical dynamics that actually played out. So I do think, I agree with Berger, at least insofar as I do think some of the ingredients that produce the situation of secularization in the West have to do with features of Western Christianity, which are, I don't know if I would necessarily say unique, but are certainly unusual. So one of those is you have in Christianity, in a way that you don't have in Islam or in what we come to call Hinduism or in Chinese traditions, the existence of one single social institution, which is sort of uniquely identified with interpreting and applying the will of God, which is the church. And this emerges partly because of the historical situation of early Christianity as a persecuted religious movement for its first 3 centuries. So for a long period of time, the kind of only social manifestation of Christianity as a movement institutionally is the church, meaning the organized body of believers under the authority of priests and eventually bishops. And this creates a possibility that you could come to identify the will of God and things having to do with God in some special and unique sense with that single social institution. And so other social institutions, even though after the Christianization of late Roman and then medieval society, they themselves are also oriented towards the will of God. So the king, for example, in medieval Western Europe, kings saw themselves as very much ruling by the will of God, as accountable to God, as themselves kind of ministers of God in a sense. There's always still this lingering sense that the church somehow is uniquely special in that regard. And one manifestation of this, I would argue, is you see kind of at the height of the power of the medieval papacy, where you have, and I'm going to forget which, I think it was a Boniface in the bull Unam Sanctam in the 14th century, saying basically like, not only is the ecclesiastical authority in the hands of the Pope, but actually so is the temporal authority. Kings governed by the pleasure of the Pope. I'm paraphrasing. And in a sense, the post-secularization understanding of religion in the West is like a weird kind of ghostly mirror of the medieval papacy's understanding of religion, right? Where religion gets then collapsed into this one social institution. And we come up with the idea that actually politics, among other things, is not intrinsically about the will of God. So I think the fact that we're able to make that secularizing move later on is partly working out an element of the logic of medieval Christendom. Not in a way that I would say is inevitable, but it was a possible path that was created by this development in medieval Christendom, which you don't see, for example, in the world of Islam, where you do not have a social institution that is analogous to the church, actually.
Right. Yeah. What about Protestantism?
So Protestantism, in most varieties, stays close enough to the medieval Catholic conception of the relationship between church and society that it's susceptible to this. There are sub-varieties of Reformed Protestantism that make a sort of more radical break from this idea. And this is super niche, but there's like this sub-movement of Calvinism that develops in the Netherlands in the 19th century, which makes the argument that actually the church isn't the mediating institution between God and all of the other social spheres, but all of the social spheres are directly accountable to God. So there's kind of an alternative Protestant version of this, which is, yeah, but it's not particularly influential. Yeah.
Do we want to? Do we?
I'm happy to continue.
It looks like we have a little bit more time. For those of you at home who need to leave, that's okay. But we're gonna take a couple more questions. We have some in the chat, so I'm gonna give voice to Sam's. He's asking Kevin if you could say something about how we should understand religiously motivated violence, specifically, you know, what we terrorism, and how your kind of revised conception of secularization would ask us to think about that.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Sam. So, I mean, here I would say really, in my view, the persuasive answer to this is William Cavanaugh's book, The Myth of Religious Violence. And actually, it's that book that first introduced me to some of these ideas that sort of started to historicize the concept of religion. So I'd say, he'll give a better answer than he gives a better answer than I will in this brief answer. But I think the framing of is violence religiously motivated is not maybe the most helpful question. So instead, if we look at motivations of violence, the question for me is what if it's ideologically motivated in the sense of people are doing something in the name of some system of values, that value system could be, in my categorization, either related to a sacred social order or it could be related to a secular order, right? So, Kavanaugh makes the somewhat provocative argument that a lot of the violence that modern Western societies carry out is in fact carried out in the name of values like individual autonomy, or at least the political manifestations of those values in the form of liberal democracy. So if we think of, the buildup of the lethal capacity of Western states during the Cold War, why did we develop weapons with the capability to wipe out all life on the planet? Well, we did it to defend democracy. Democracy being a political expression of some of our deepest values as a society, which have to do with individual autonomy, among other things. It's a little bit more complex than that, of course, but at a high level, that's at least part of what's going on. What was the justification for some of the more recent wars that Western states have fought in places like Afghanistan and Iraq? It's related to that system of values. So to me, the better question is, what's the ultimate system of values? And that kind of gets us a little bit it gives us a little bit more distance from, do we happen to agree with that system of values or not? I'm tempted to say more, but maybe I'll stop there. So to conclude, I think people can carry out violence, either terrorism or state-sponsored violence, military action, etc., in the name of a wide variety of value systems. Those value systems might be forms of sacred social order, and of course can be and have been forms of sacred social order. They can also be motivated in terms of the values of different kinds of secular orders, whether those are the kind of liberal individualistic Western form, whether they're the collectivistic form that we saw in communist regimes in the 20th century. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, Sam, but that's maybe how I would begin.
All right, we have two more questions from the chat. The first is, okay, Kevin. So if there is no such thing as religion, what does that mean for God?
Yeah, interesting question. Thank you, Andreen. So, the argument that I'm making here, I hope that whether the audience of the argument is people who definitely believe that God does exist, or people who believe that he doesn't, or anything in between, I kind of want to persuade everybody. It is true that it has been a very widespread sort of human intuition that there are powers above human beings. Some people have thought, there's a single God. Some people have thought in terms of God. Some people have thought in more impersonal terms of cosmic order. Most human societies have thought, there are powers in the universe to which we are accountable in some sense that are not human. In our society, there's now a lot more people, not a majority perhaps, but more than has normally been the case historically, who would say, well, we're not sure that there's any powers or authorities higher than the human. But I think the success of my argument that I'm making here really works either way. There's ways from a secular perspective that you might explain or explain away the very widespread human tendency to think of powers above human beings. Maybe we have just kind of overdeveloped agency detection systems that developed through the course of evolution, and so we're prone to see agents to whom we assign personality and will everywhere, even where they don't exist. And that has maybe some evolutionary utility if we align that with systems of moral order, and societies that have that are more likely to survive. It's kind of like an evolutionary psychology argument for why this might have happened. So somebody like Jonathan Haidt, for example, might make an argument like that. Or we could say, well, actually, the reasons that human beings very widely have believed this is true is because it is. There are, in fact, suprahuman powers, maybe a great variety of them, that do have some power over human life. And maybe, it's more philosophically satisfying to locate systems of moral order in some kind of superhuman authority that can anchor them. But yeah, so I would say, and again, I don't know, Andreen, if this necessarily is answering the question you had in mind. But I think somebody who believes in God, somebody who doesn't believe in God, I think this argument could work either way. It's sort of agnostic with respect to that question.
All right, and our final question is from Brian Cole, who seems to be asking you whether there's maybe some kind of analogy, or if not, then is there a difference between, say, the distinction between between religion and the secular and say spiritual versus temporal.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, so this connects, I think, back to the answer that I had to Galen's question. I do think that to some extent, maybe to a large extent, the religious secular distinction is borrowing from or gets some of its force from the previously existing spiritual versus temporal distinction. So this distinction exists, much farther back in Christian history, and the concept secular originally refers to a long period of time. The root Latin word refers to a long period of time, and it comes to mean sort of this present age, which is also sort of the connotation of temporal. It's of the time that we're in. And so it gets borrowed to mean sort of this present age or worldly, in distinction with the older meaning, the medieval meaning of the term religious, which means belonging to a religious order. And so we get this kind of arrangement, which I think Catholics are still used to hearing, but to non-Catholics sounds really weird, to talk about religious priests and secular priests, by which they mean priests who are members of religious orders and priests that are not. When we hear secular priests, we're like, what is that? Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or something? But no, they just mean priests who are not a part of religious orders. And so again, that kind of mental architecture of a distinction between the people who are maybe somehow more closely related to God and what God is doing in the world and things that are more distant, I think that paves the way for, again, doesn't necessitate, but paves the way for this religious secular distinction that emerges in a series of stages between the 17th and 19th centuries.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today, folks. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and thanks to everyone for coming out in person.